Dr. Marcus Chen had never wanted to be famous. He had joined the Terran Colonial Medical Corps because he believed in healing, not because he sought glory on distant battlefields. But as he stood in the cramped medical bay of the transport vessel Mercy's Call, watching the swirling blue vortex of hyperspace through the small porthole, he knew his quiet life was about to end forever. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, and Marcus steadied himself against the medical table. Captain Torres's voice crackled through the intercom, tense and urgent. "All hands prepare for emergency deployment. We've got wounded coming in from Kepler 442b. Heavy casualties reported." Marcus had served on 12 different worlds in his 8 years with the Corps, but he had never seen anything like what awaited him on Kepler 442b. The planet was supposed to be a routine mining operation, harvesting rare minerals from the asteroid's scarred surface. Instead, it had become humanity's first contact with a hostile alien species. The Zephyrians had emerged from underground caverns without warning, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming like black metal in the harsh sunlight. They stood nearly 3 meters tall with forearms ending in razor-sharp claws and mandibles that could crush human bones like twigs. But it wasn't their physical appearance that made them so terrifying. It was their intelligence and their absolute determination to eliminate every human on the planet. As the transport touched down on the makeshift landing pad, Marcus could see the smoke rising from the mining colony in the distance. Wounded soldiers were already being carried toward the ship, their faces pale with pain and shock. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, a young Marine whose left arm hung at an impossible angle. "Doc, thank God you're here," she gasped as Marcus knelt beside her stretcher. They came out of nowhere. "We lost half the squad in the first 5 minutes." Marcus quickly assessed her injuries. Compound fracture of the humerus, possible internal bleeding, severe dehydration. He began working immediately, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he stabilized her condition. Around him, other medics were treating burns, lacerations, and trauma wounds that spoke of a battle unlike anything in human experience. "What are we dealing with out there?" Marcus asked as he inserted an IV line into Sarah's uninjured arm. "They're smart, Doc. Smarter than we thought possible. They use tactics, coordinate attacks, and they don't seem to feel pain like we do. We hit one with enough plasma fire to drop a tank, and it kept coming until its entire torso was gone." As Marcus worked, he noticed something that would haunt him for weeks to come. Every wounded soldier mentioned the same thing. The Zephyrians had focused their attacks on medics and medical facilities. They had specifically targeted anyone wearing the Red Cross symbol of the Medical Corps, as if they understood that eliminating healers would demoralize human forces more than any direct assault. The pattern became clearer over the following days as more casualties arrived. The Zephyrians weren't just trying to win territory. They were conducting psychological warfare. They knew that humans valued the lives of their wounded, and they were exploiting that compassion as a weakness. Marcus found himself working 18-hour shifts, moving from patient to patient, with barely enough time to eat or sleep. He treated plasma burns that had melted through combat armor, puncture wounds from Zephyrian claws that seemed to carry some kind of toxin, and psychological trauma that left hardened veterans trembling like children. But it was during the treatment of Corporal Williams that Marcus first realized how the enemy saw him. Williams had been caught in a Zephyrian ambush while trying to evacuate wounded from an outpost. He had managed to escape, but not before overhearing something that chilled Marcus to the bone. "They know about you, Doc," Williams whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I heard them talking in their clicking language. They mentioned the human healer by name. They called you the Lifebringer, and said you were more dangerous than any soldier." Marcus paused in his examination, a cold chill running down his spine. "What do you mean they know my name?" "I don't know how, but they do. They said Dr. Marcus Chen was keeping too many humans alive, making it harder for them to break our will to fight. They want you dead, Doc. They want you dead more than they want our commander." The revelation should have terrified Marcus, but instead, it filled him with a strange sense of purpose. If the Zephyrians saw healing as an act of war, then he would give them war. Not with weapons or explosives, but with something far more powerful. The absolute refusal to let another human being die on his watch. That night, as Marcus finally allowed himself a few hours of rest, he made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. He pulled up the personnel files of every medic. In the Colonial Medical Corps, and began composing a message that would be transmitted to medical facilities on every human world. The message was simple but revolutionary. Marcus proposed a new protocol for combat medicine, one that emphasized not just treating the wounded, but actively hunting down casualties in hostile territory. He outlined techniques for battlefield surgery that could save lives even under direct enemy fire, and he detailed new evacuation procedures that would ensure no wounded soldier was left behind. More importantly, he included detailed observations about Zephyrian anatomy and physiology that he had gleaned from treating human wounds. Their claws contained a paralytic toxin that could be neutralized with a specific combination of adrenaline and synthetic antibodies. Their exoskeletons were vulnerable to focused electromagnetic pulses at certain frequencies. Their psychological profile suggested they feared anything that challenged their perception of human weakness. As he sent the message into the hyperspace communication network, Marcus didn't realize he was writing the first chapter of what would become known as the Chen Protocols, a comprehensive guide to combat medicine that would save millions of human lives and earn him a reputation that would spread fear through alien civilizations across the known galaxy. Outside his small quarters, the war continued. Zephyrian attack ships circled the mining colony like hungry predators, and the sounds of distant explosions echoed through the night. But inside the medical bay, human beings continued to live because one doctor had decided that healing was not a passive act of mercy, but an active declaration of war against death itself. The Zephyrians had made a fatal mistake. They had turned a healer into an enemy, and they would soon learn that there was nothing more dangerous in the universe than a human being who refused to let others die. 3 weeks after the first Zephyrian attack, Marcus Chen stood in what had once been the mining colony's main cafeteria, now converted into the largest field hospital in human history. The space buzzed with controlled chaos as dozens of medics, nurses, and support staff worked around the clock to save lives that conventional military doctrine would have written off as acceptable losses. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After Marcus's message had spread throughout the Colonial Medical Corps, volunteers had begun arriving from across human space. They came bearing new equipment, experimental treatments, and most importantly, a shared commitment to the principle that no human life was expendable. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a trauma surgeon from the core worlds, approached Marcus as he finished treating a Marine whose legs had been shattered by Zephyrian bioweapons. "The new neural interface implants are working better than we hoped," she reported, her voice filled with quiet excitement. "We can now coordinate field operations with unprecedented precision." Marcus nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. The neural interfaces were his latest innovation, small devices that allowed medics to share sensory data and coordinate treatment protocols in real time. When one medic encountered a new type of injury or discovered an effective treatment, the information was instantly available to every other medic in the network. But the technology had implications far beyond simple communication. The Zephyrians had learned to track human radio transmissions and use them to target medical teams. The neural interfaces used quantum entanglement for instant, undetectable communication across any distance. For the first time since the war began, human medics could coordinate their efforts without fear of enemy interception. "There's something else," Elena continued, lowering her voice. "The intelligence reports are coming in from other worlds. The Zephyrians aren't just targeting our medical corps here. They're doing it everywhere they encounter human forces. It's like they've identified our commitment to preserving life as our primary weakness." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the colony's failing environmental systems. If the Zephyrians were adapting their tactics across multiple star systems, it meant they were sharing information faster than human military intelligence had believed possible. It also meant that his reputation was spreading beyond this single planet. The proof came during the next major Zephyrian assault. Marcus was in the middle of performing surgery on a young communications officer when the attack sirens began wailing. Through the reinforced windows of the hospital, he could see Zephyrian shock troops advancing across the cratered landscape, their black exoskeletons reflecting the orange glow of burning structures. But something was different about this attack. Instead of the random destruction that had characterized previous assaults, the Zephyrians moved with surgical precision toward specific targets. They bypassed fortified military positions and headed straight for medical facilities. "They're not trying to take territory," observed Major Harrison, the colony's military commander, as he watched the tactical display. "They're hunting medics." Marcus continued his surgery even as explosions rocked the building around him. The communications officer had severe internal bleeding, and any interruption in the procedure would mean certain death. Around him, other medical staff continued their work with the same grim determination, guided by the principle that had become the unofficial motto of the Chen protocols. "We do not stop. We do not retreat. We do not leave anyone behind." The Zephyrian assault reached the hospital's outer perimeter, just as Marcus completed the surgery. Through the neural interface, he could sense the positions of every medic in the facility and coordinate their actions as if they were extensions of his own body. It was a level of tactical awareness that no military commander in human history had ever possessed. "Evacuation teams to the North Wing," Marcus transmitted through the neural link. "Zephyrian breach detected. Priority patients first, but nobody gets left behind." What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations to come. The medical staff didn't flee in panic or abandon their patients to save themselves. Instead, they executed a coordinated withdrawal that resembled a military operation more than a medical evacuation. Patients were moved according to precisely calculated priorities, with the most critical cases receiving protection from combat medics who had been trained in both healing and warfare. The Zephyrians had expected to find helpless healers cowering in terror. Instead, they encountered organized resistance that seemed to anticipate their every move. Medical teams used knowledge of Zephyrian physiology to deploy specific countermeasures: electromagnetic pulse devices that disrupted their nervous systems, targeted chemical agents that interfered with their paralytic toxins, and tactical maneuvers that exploited weaknesses in their exoskeleton design. For the first time since the war began, a Zephyrian assault was not just repelled but decisively defeated. The alien forces retreated in confusion, leaving behind equipment and wounded that provided valuable intelligence about their capabilities and weaknesses. But the victory came at a cost that only Marcus fully understood. As he stood among the wounded Zephyrians in the aftermath of the battle, he realized that his medical knowledge had been weaponized in ways he had never intended. The same expertise that allowed him to save human lives had been used to more effectively kill alien ones. The ethical implications weighed heavily on his mind as he began treating the wounded Zephyrians. Despite everything they had done, despite their targeting of medics and their ruthless tactics, Marcus couldn't bring himself to abandon his oath as a healer. He worked to stabilize their injuries with the same dedication he showed to human patients. It was during this treatment that Marcus made a discovery that would change everything. The Zephyrian biochemistry was far more complex than anyone had realized. Their apparent inability to feel pain wasn't due to natural physiology. It was the result of extensive chemical modification that suppressed their natural empathy and fear responses. In other words, the Zephyrians weren't naturally violent. They had been deliberately turned into living weapons by some form of chemical conditioning that could potentially be reversed. The wounded Zephyrian that Marcus was treating suddenly grabbed his arm with surprising gentleness. When it spoke, its voice carried none of the harsh clicking sounds that characterized normal Zephyrian communication. Instead, it produced something that sounded almost like human speech. "You heal?" it asked, its mandibles moving in what might have been confusion or curiosity. Marcus stared into its compound eyes and saw something he had never expected to find. In an enemy, intelligence, fear, and perhaps even gratitude. In that moment, he realized that the war was far more complicated than anyone had understood. The Zephyrians weren't just alien invaders. They were victims of something even more sinister. But he also knew that this knowledge made him more dangerous to the real enemy than ever before. If he could find a way to reverse the chemical conditioning that turned peaceful beings into weapons of war, he might be able to end the conflict without destroying an entire species. The question was whether he would live long enough to develop such a treatment, and whether the Zephyrians would give him the chance to try. The underground laboratory that Marcus had established beneath the mining colony was a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. What had once been a storage facility for mining equipment had been transformed into a state-of-the-art research center, complete with biochemical analysis equipment, surgical facilities, and secure containment areas for the most dangerous research in human history. For 6 weeks, Marcus had been working around the clock to understand the chemical modifications that turned peaceful Zephyrians into relentless warriors. The work was dangerous not just because of the volatile compounds involved, but because each breakthrough made him a more valuable target for whoever was behind the Zephyrian transformation. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged from the isolation chamber where they had been treating the wounded Zephyrian that Marcus had captured during the last battle. The creature had been cooperative, even helpful, once the combat chemicals began to clear from its system. Through painstaking communication, they had learned that its name was something like Kethvar, and that it had once been a peaceful botanist on its homeworld. "The neural scans are remarkable," Elena reported, pulling up holographic displays that showed cross-sections of Kethvar's brain. "The chemical conditioning doesn't just suppress empathy and fear, it actually rewrites core personality structures. But the original personality remains intact underneath, like a dormant program waiting to be reactivated." Marcus studied the data with growing excitement and horror. The implications were staggering. An entire species had been enslaved not through physical force, but through biochemical manipulation so sophisticated that the victims weren't even aware they had been changed. "Have you been able to identify the source of the conditioning?" Marcus asked, knowing that the answer might determine the fate of both species. "That's the disturbing part," Elena replied, her voice grim. "The chemical signatures don't match anything in our databases, but they do show traces of elements that are extremely rare in this part of the galaxy. Whoever is doing this has access to resources and technology that surpasses both human and Zephyrian capabilities." The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The war between humans and Zephyrians wasn't a simple territorial conflict. It was part of something much more sinister. Some unknown force was using the Zephyrians as weapons to eliminate human expansion into this sector of space. Marcus was interrupted by an urgent transmission through the neural interface. It was Captain Torres from the Mercy's call, and his mental voice carried a tone of barely controlled panic. "Doc, we've got a problem. Long-range sensors are picking up a massive Zephyrian fleet approaching the system. But they're not alone. The ships are accompanied by vessels that don't match any known Zephyrian designs. We estimate arrival in 72 hours. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. If unknown aliens were directing Zephyrian forces, it meant that his research had attracted attention from the real enemy. They were coming to eliminate him and his work before he could expose their manipulation. But Marcus had learned something during his months on the battlefield that would serve him well in the coming crisis. He had discovered that the greatest weapon in the human arsenal wasn't any piece of technology or military strategy. It was the absolute refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. "Elena, how long would it take to synthesize enough of the antidote to treat a significant number of Zephyrians?" Marcus asked, his mind already working on a plan that bordered on insanity. "With our current facilities? Weeks, maybe months. But Marcus, even if we could produce it, how would we deliver it? The Zephyrians would never willingly accept treatment that would break their conditioning." Marcus smiled grimly. "They don't need to accept it willingly. We're going to weaponize compassion." Over the next 24 hours, Marcus and his team worked to implement the most audacious medical intervention in human history. Using the same delivery systems that had been developed for combat medical supplies, they began producing aerosol versions of the antidote that could be dispersed through a planet's atmosphere. The plan was simple in concept, but incredibly complex in execution. When the Zephyrian fleet arrived, human forces would engage them in what appeared to be a conventional battle. But instead of trying to destroy the enemy, they would use every available means to disperse the antidote. Throughout the Zephyrian ships and ground forces, the real challenge wasn't technical. It was convincing the human military commanders that the strategy had any chance of success. Major Harrison was the first to voice the obvious concern. "Dr. Chen, with all due respect, you're asking us to bet the lives of every human in this system on the hope that these creatures will suddenly become friendly once their chemical conditioning is broken. What if you're wrong? What if they remain hostile even after treatment?" Marcus looked around at the faces of the military leaders, medics, and scientists who had gathered in the makeshift command center. These people had followed him this far because they believed in his vision of medicine as an act of defiance against death. Now he was asking them to take that vision to its logical extreme. Major, in the past 3 months we've proven that Zephyrians can be reasoned with once their conditioning breaks down. Kethvar has provided us with detailed information about Zephyrian society, technology, and the alien manipulation they've suffered. More importantly, it has shown genuine remorse for the actions it was forced to take while under chemical control. Marcus activated a recording device that projected Kethvar's voice throughout the room. The Zephyrian spoke in halting but increasingly fluent human standard, its words carrying an emotional weight that was impossible to ignore. "My people are not evil," Kethvar said. "We were gardeners, scientists, artists. The Dark Ones came to our world and made us into weapons against our will. We remember everything we have done, but we could not control our actions. If Dr. Chen can free my people from this curse, then humans and Zephyrians can stand together against the true enemy." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Marcus was right, they weren't just fighting for human survival. They were fighting to liberate an entire species from slavery. If he was wrong, they would all be dead within days. Captain Torres was the first to speak. "Doc, your medical protocols have saved more lives than any military strategy we've ever implemented. If you think this plan can work, then we'll make it work." One by one, the other commanders voiced their agreement. Not because they were certain of success, but because they had learned to trust in the principle that had guided Marcus from the beginning. The absolute commitment to preserving life, no matter how impossible the odds. As the Zephyrian fleet approached the outer edge of the star system, Marcus made final preparations for a battle unlike any in galactic history. He would fight not with weapons designed to kill, but with medicine designed to heal. He would turn compassion into a weapon and empathy into a strategy. The unknown aliens who had manipulated the Zephyrians were about to learn that they had made a critical error. They had assumed that humanity's greatest weakness was their refusal to abandon their wounded. Instead, they were about to discover that this apparent weakness was actually their greatest strength. The battle began at SO 347 ship time, when the first Zephyrian vessels entered the system's outer defense perimeter, but this wasn't like any battle that had ever been fought in the galaxy. Instead of defensive positions designed to maximize enemy casualties, human forces had arranged themselves to optimize the distribution of Marcus's antidote aerosol. From his position in the command center, Marcus watched as dozens of specially modified medical drones launched from human ships, each one carrying enough antidote to affect thousands of Zephyrian warriors. The drones were designed to look like conventional weapons platforms, but their payload was healing rather than destruction. "First wave of drones approaching Zephyrian formation," reported Lieutenant Kim from the tactical station. "They're taking the bait. Enemy fighters are moving to intercept." Marcus held his breath as the drones began to detonate among the Zephyrian ships. Instead of explosions that would damage hull plating or disable engines, the devices released clouds of antidote that would be drawn into the ship's life support systems. Within minutes, every Zephyrian crew member would be breathing air laced with the compound that could restore their original personalities. But the plan had a critical flaw that Marcus had known about from the beginning. The antidote took time to work, anywhere from 20 minutes to several hours depending on how deeply entrenched the chemical conditioning had become. During that time, the Zephyrians would continue to fight with their usual ruthless efficiency. The human forces had to survive long enough for compassion to become their greatest weapon. Zephyrian ground forces are landing on the southern continent, Captain Torres reported through the neural interface. Estimated strength, 50,000 warriors plus support equipment. They're heading straight for the mining colony. Marcus closed his eyes and reached out through the neural network that connected every human medic in the system. He could sense their positions, their stress levels, their determination to see the plan through despite the overwhelming odds. Through their shared consciousness, he spoke words that would be remembered long after the last shot was fired. "Remember why we're here. We're not just fighting for human survival. We're fighting to free an enslaved species and to show the galaxy that there are alternatives to endless war. Hold the line. Trust in the plan. And never forget that every life we save today makes us stronger tomorrow." The response that came back through the neural link was a wave of shared determination that strengthened Marcus's resolve. These weren't just medics and doctors anymore. They were the guardians of hope in a universe that seemed determined to crush it. The first sign that the antidote was working came from Sergeant Williams, who was leading a defensive position near the colony's main entrance. "Doc, something weird is happening out here. The Zephyrians are slowing down and some of them look confused. A few have actually stopped fighting and are just standing there staring at their weapons." Marcus felt a surge of excitement, but he forced himself to remain calm. The partial success of individual Zephyrians wasn't enough. He needed massive numbers of them to break free from their conditioning, simultaneously to create the psychological impact that would end the battle. That moment came, 47 minutes after the first antidote deployment. Across the battlefield, Zephyrian warriors began to stop mid-charge, their weapons falling from suddenly trembling claws. The change wasn't gradual, it was like watching a vast machine suddenly lose power and coast to a stop. But the real test came when the unknown alien ships that had accompanied the Zephyrian fleet began to respond to the breakdown in their proxy army. The vessels were unlike anything in human or Zephyrian databases, sleek, organic-looking craft that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When they opened fire, their weapons produced effects that defied current understanding of physics. "Unknown hostiles are targeting the freed Zephyrians," Lieutenant Kim reported, her voice tight with alarm. "They're not trying to recapture them. They're trying to eliminate them." Marcus realized with growing horror that the unknown aliens had a contingency plan for exactly this scenario. Rather than risk exposure by trying to maintain control over the Zephyrians, they were prepared to eliminate their proxy army entirely and find another species to manipulate. But they had underestimated the effect that liberation would have on Zephyrian psychology. As the chemical conditioning broke down and original personalities reasserted themselves, the freed Zephyrians didn't retreat in confusion or surrender in despair. Instead, they turned their considerable combat skills against their former masters with a fury that bordered on religious fervor. "Kethavar's," voice echoed through the human communication systems as it coordinated the Zephyrian response. "My people, remember who you were before the Dark Ones stole your minds. Remember your families, your homes, your dreams. Now is the time to reclaim them all." The battle that followed was unlike anything Marcus could have imagined when he first conceived his plan. Humans and Zephyrians fought side by side against an enemy that had manipulated both species into warfare. The very weapons and tactics that had made the Zephyrians such formidable opponents were now turned against their true oppressors. But the unknown aliens possessed technology that was centuries ahead of either human or Zephyrian capabilities. Their ships could phase in and out of normal space, making them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. Their energy weapons could disintegrate matter at the molecular level, and their defensive systems seemed to adapt to any attack pattern. Marcus watched the tactical display with growing desperation, as human and Zephyrian forces took massive casualties against an enemy that seemed invincible. All his planning, all his innovations in combat medicine, all his faith in the power of compassion, none of it mattered if they couldn't find a way to fight an enemy that existed partially outside normal spacetime. It was then that Marcus remembered something Kethvar had mentioned during their conversations about Zephyrian history. Before the unknown aliens had arrived on their world, the Zephyrians had been developing something called harmonic resonance technology, a form of science that used sound and vibration to affect matter at the quantum level. "Elena, can you access the Zephyrian technical databases that Kethvar provided?" Marcus asked urgently. "I need information about harmonic resonance weapons." "Marcus, what are you thinking? We don't have time to develop new weapons technology in the middle of a battle. We don't need to develop it. We need to adapt it. The medical scanners we use for neural interface synchronization operate on similar principles. If we can modify them to produce the right frequency patterns, we might be able to disrupt the aliens' phasing technology." What followed was the most intense collaboration between human and Zephyrian scientists in galactic history. Working through the neural interface network, teams of researchers on both sides began modifying medical equipment into weapons that could affect targets existing in multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, the breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the same quantum entanglement technology that allowed instant communication through the neural interface could be used to synchronize attacks across multiple ships. Instead of individual weapons firing independently, the entire fleet could act as a single, massive harmonic resonance array. When the modified medical scanners fired in perfect synchronization, the effect was immediate and devastating. The unknown alien ship suddenly became fully visible in normal spacetime. Their exotic defenses stripped away by harmonic frequencies that disrupted their quantum stability. For the first time since the battle began, the mysterious enemy was vulnerable to conventional weapons. Human and Zephyrian forces pressed their advantage with desperate fury, knowing that this might be their only chance to eliminate the threat that had manipulated them into war. But Marcus knew that winning this battle was only the beginning. If there were aliens capable of enslaving entire species through biochemical manipulation, then there were probably others with different but equally dangerous capabilities. Humanity and their new Zephyrian allies would need to prepare for threats beyond anything they had previously imagined. The silence that followed the destruction of the unknown alien fleet was more unsettling than the chaos of battle had been. Marcus stood in the command center, watching as the last enemy ship disintegrated under the combined firepower of human and Zephyrian vessels, but he felt no sense of victory. Instead, he was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had discovered. The defeated aliens weren't just another hostile species, they were part of something much larger and more terrifying. The technology recovered from their ships revealed evidence of manipulation campaigns spanning dozens of star systems, with multiple species being turned into unwilling weapons against their neighbors. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached with a datapad containing the preliminary analysis of the alien technology. Her face was pale with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "Marcus, you need to see this. The databases we recovered contain references to at least 30 different species that have been subjected to some form of mental or biochemical control. The scale of this operation is beyond anything we imagined." Marcus took the datapad and scrolled through information that challenged everything he thought he knew about galactic civilization. The unknown aliens, yet who seemed to call themselves something that translated roughly as the Architects, had been conducting systematic manipulation campaigns for thousands of years. They would identify promising species, subject them to various forms of control, and then use them to eliminate or weaken potential rivals. But what disturbed Marcus most was the pattern of species selection. The Architects didn't target the most powerful civilizations first. Instead, they focused on species with specific traits that made them useful as weapons: intelligence, adaptability, emotional complexity, and most importantly, the capacity for rapid technological development under pressure. Humanity had been next on their list. "Kethvar wants to speak with you," Elena said, gesturing toward the communication terminal. "It's been analyzing the same data, and I think it's reached some conclusions that we need to hear." Marcus activated the communication link and saw Kethvar's image appear on the holographic display. The Zephyrian had changed dramatically since its liberation from chemical conditioning. Its posture was more upright but less aggressive, and its compound eyes seemed to hold depths of emotion that Marcus had never seen in any of the conditioned warriors. "Dr. Chen," Kethvar began, its voice carrying harmonics that somehow conveyed both gratitude and deep concern. "My analysis of the Architect databases has revealed something that your people must understand. The conflict between humans and Zephyrians was not random. We were specifically chosen because our combined capabilities would create the perfect weapon against a third species." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, a third species?" "The Architect's ultimate target in this sector is a civilization called the Etherians. They are pacifists by nature, with technology focused on creation rather than destruction. But they possess something that the Architects desperately want: the ability to manipulate matter at the quantum level through pure thought." The implications were staggering. If the Architects could gain control over quantum manipulation technology, they could potentially reshape reality itself according to their will. No species in the galaxy would be able to resist them. The war between humans and Zephyrians was designed to produce specific technological developments, Kethvar continued. "Your medical innovations, combined with our biological adaptations and natural combat abilities, would have created the perfect weapon for subduing a pacifist species. We would have been used to capture Etherian quantum manipulation specialists alive for study and eventual control." Marcus realized that his neural interface technology, his combat medical protocols, even his success in breaking Zephyrian conditioning, all of it had been anticipated by the Architects. They had manipulated the entire conflict to push both species toward innovations that would serve their ultimate purpose. But they had made a critical error. By allowing humans and Zephyrians to work together, even unintentionally, they had created something they hadn't planned for, a true alliance between species that had learned to trust each other through shared sacrifice. "Where are the Etherians now?" Marcus asked. "According to the databases, they have withdrawn to a hidden system beyond the galactic rim. They know about the architect threat and have been developing defenses, but their pacifist nature limits their options. They need allies who can fight while they create." Marcus looked around the command center at the human and Zephyrian officers who had gathered to listen to the conversation. These beings had fought against each other with deadly efficiency, but they had also learned to work together when faced with a common threat. If they could forge a lasting alliance, they might be able to offer the Etherians something that their pacifist philosophy couldn't provide: protection through strength. But first, they needed to understand the full scope of what they were facing. The destruction of one architect fleet was just the beginning. There would be others, and they would be prepared for the tactics that had worked in this battle. "Elena, I want you to coordinate with Kethvar on a complete analysis of the architect technology," Marcus said. "We need to understand their capabilities, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their ultimate goals. If we're going to protect the Etherians and free the other enslaved species, we need to know exactly what we're up against." Over the next several days, Marcus found himself at the center of the most important diplomatic and strategic planning effort in human history. Representatives from Earth's government arrived aboard high-speed courier ships, along with Zephyrian leaders who had been freed from conditioning on other worlds. Together they began to plan not just for humanity's survival, but for a coordinated resistance movement that could span multiple star systems. The neural interface technology that Marcus had developed for medical coordination proved invaluable for diplomatic purposes as well. Humans and Zephyrians could share thoughts and emotions directly, eliminating the misunderstandings that often complicated interspecies negotiations. For the first time, two different species could truly understand each other's perspectives. But the planning sessions also revealed the enormous challenges they faced. The architects had been operating for millennia, and their manipulation campaigns had created a galaxy full of enslaved species that would fight against any liberation attempt. Worse, many of the enslaved species didn't even know they were being controlled, making it impossible to distinguish between willing enemies and unwilling victims. It was during one of these planning sessions that Marcus made a proposal that shocked everyone present. "We need to find the Etherians and offer them an alliance, but we can't approach them as conquerors or protectors. We need to come to them as healers." Major Harrison, who had been promoted to overall military commander of the Human Zephyrian Alliance, raised an obvious objection. "Dr. Chen, the Etherians are pacifists. They're not going to trust a military force no matter how well-intentioned." "That's exactly why we need to approach them through medicine," Marcus replied. "The architect databases contain information about dozens of enslaved species. Many of them have been subjected to conditioning that's even more sophisticated than what was used on the Zephyrians. If we can develop treatments for other forms of mental control, we can offer the Etherians something that aligns with their values, the ability to heal and liberate without destroying." Kethvar's response came through the neural interface, carrying harmonics of excitement and hope. "The doctor speaks wisdom. Among my people, the greatest honor is not given to warriors, but to those who can restore what has been lost. If we can become healers of the mind as well as the body, we will earn the trust of any species that values life over death." As Marcus looked around at the faces of humans and Zephyrians working together to plan a mission that would determine the fate of galactic civilization, he realized that his journey from simple medic to galactic game-changer was far from over. The skills he had developed in treating battlefield wounds would now be applied to healing the psychological trauma of entire species. The architects had made him into an enemy by targeting healers in their proxy wars. Now he would turn that enmity back against them by becoming the one thing they couldn't understand or counter, a force that grew stronger through compassion rather than conquest. The journey to the hidden Etherian system took 3 months aboard the newly constructed vessel, Harmony's Edge, a ship that represented the best of human engineering and Zephyrian biotechnology. Marcus spent most of the journey in the ship's expanded medical bay, working with Kethvar and a team of liberated Zephyrian, scientists to develop treatments for the various forms of mental conditioning they had discovered in the architect databases. Each enslaved species presented unique challenges. The Korthak had been subjected to genetic modifications that enhanced aggression while suppressing critical thinking. The Venlari had implants that could override their natural decision-making processes. The Zerian had been exposed to quantum fields that altered their perception of reality itself. But the most disturbing discovery was that the architects had been experimenting with different control methods for thousands of years, refining their techniques with each new species they encountered. They weren't just conquerors. They were scientists conducting the largest psychological and biological experiment in galactic history. The pattern is becoming clear, Dr. Elena Vasquez reported during one of their regular briefings. The architects aren't trying to build an empire in the traditional sense. They're trying to create a galaxy populated entirely by species that serve specific functions in their grand design. Marcus looked up from the biochemical analysis he had been reviewing. What kind of functions? Warriors, builders, thinkers, creators. Each enslaved species has been modified to excel in particular areas while losing the capacity for independent action. It's like they're trying to construct a living machine on a galactic scale. The implications were terrifying. If the architects succeeded in their ultimate goal, the galaxy would become a vast collection of specialized slave species, each one perfectly adapted for their assigned role, but incapable of questioning the system that controlled them. But as Marcus studied the data, he began to see patterns that the architects might not have anticipated. Each form of conditioning left specific biochemical signatures, and many of these signatures had common elements that suggested universal vulnerabilities. Kethvar, look at these enzyme patterns, Marcus said, highlighting sections of the analysis on his display. Every form of architect conditioning seems to suppress the production of certain neurotransmitters that are associated with empathy and long-term thinking. If we could find a way to boost production of these compounds, we could potentially break multiple forms of conditioning simultaneously. Kethvar finished, its voice carrying harmonics of excitement. But the delivery method would be crucial. Different species have vastly different biochemistries. Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. That's where the Etherian quantum manipulation technology could be invaluable. If they can alter matter at the quantum level through thought alone, they might be able to modify our antidotes to work on any biological system. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the bridge. Captain Torres's voice carried a note of tension that immediately put everyone on alert. Dr. Chen, we're approaching the coordinates that Kethvar provided, but our sensors aren't detecting any star system. Are you sure we're in the right location? Marcus and Kethvar exchanged glances before making their way to the bridge. The main display showed empty space where the Etherian system should have been, with no trace of stars, planets, or artificial structures. But Kethvar seemed unsurprised by the apparent absence of their destination. The Etherians have hidden their system using quantum manipulation technology. They exist in the same location as our reality, but shifted slightly into parallel dimensional space. We need to transmit a specific harmonic sequence to request permission to enter their reality. What followed was the most delicate first contact procedure in human history, using the harmonic resonance technology that had been developed during the battle with the architects. The Harmony's Edge transmitted a complex mathematical sequence that Kethvar had found in ancient Zephyrian archives. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Space around the ship seemed to ripple like water, and suddenly they were surrounded by a star system that was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. The planets were connected by streams of pure energy that pulsed with patterns of impossible beauty. Structures that seemed to be grown rather than built orbited the stars, their surfaces shifting and changing as if they were alive. Greetings. Travelers from the material realm, came a voice that seemed to speak directly into their minds rather than through their ears. We are the Etherians, and we have been expecting you. The being that appeared on their communication screen was humanoid in basic structure, but seemed to be composed of living light rather than solid matter. Its form shifted constantly, as if it existed in multiple quantum states simultaneously. I am called Resonance of Distant Stars by those who know me, the being continued. We have observed your struggle against the architects, and we are greatly impressed by your success in liberating the Zephyrian people. But we must ask, why have you come to us? Marcus stepped forward, feeling the weight of representing not just humanity, but all the enslaved species in the galaxy. We've come to offer an alliance. The architects have enslaved dozens of species and are planning to use them to capture your people for their quantum manipulation abilities. We want to help you defend yourselves, and we want to work together to free the other enslaved species. Resonance of Distant Stars was silent for a long moment, its form flickering through colors that had no names in any human language. You speak of alliance, but your ship carries weapons designed for destruction. How can we trust warriors who make war their solution to conflict? It was Kethavar who answered, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the Ethereans' energy patterns. Because these warriors have chosen to become healers. Dr. Chen and his people do not seek to destroy their enemies. They seek to heal them of the conditioning that makes them enemies in the first place. Marcus activated his neural interface and shared his memories of treating wounded Zephyrians, of developing the antidote that had freed them from mental conditioning, of the moments when enemies became allies through the simple act of healing rather than harming. The effect on Resonance of Distant Stars was immediate and profound. Its form stabilized into something that conveyed deep emotion, and when it spoke again, its mental voice carried overtones of wonder and hope. In all our observations of the material realm, we have never encountered beings who would choose healing over conquest when faced with existential threat. Your Dr. Chen has discovered something that we believed was unique to our species. The understanding that true strength comes from the preservation and enhancement of life, not its destruction. What followed was a diplomatic breakthrough that would reshape the galaxy. The Ethereans agreed not just to an alliance, but to a partnership that would combine their quantum manipulation abilities with human medical knowledge and Zephyrian biological expertise. But the partnership came with a warning that chilled Marcus to the bone. The Ethereans had been monitoring architect activities for millennia, and they had discovered something that changed everything. The architects weren't just another species seeking galactic domination. They were refugees from a dying universe, desperately trying to recreate their lost civilization by reshaping an entire galaxy to match their needs. They are not evil in the way you understand evil, Resonance of Distant Stars explained. They are desperate, and desperation has driven them to acts that violate every principle of ethical existence. But their desperation also makes them incredibly dangerous because they have nothing left to lose. Marcus realized that the conflict was even more complex than he had imagined. The architects weren't just invaders to be defeated. They were refugees whose actions were driven by the need to preserve their entire species from extinction. Any solution would need to address not just the liberation of enslaved species, but the underlying crisis that had driven the architects to such desperate measures. But for the first time since the war began, Marcus felt genuinely optimistic about the future. With Etherean quantum manipulation technology, human medical innovation, and Zephyrian biological knowledge working together, they might be able to find a solution that saved everyone, including the architects themselves. 2 years after first contact with the Ethereans, Marcus Chen stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed station Haven's Promise, watching as ships from 43 different species approached through the quantum fold network that the Ethereans had helped establish. Each vessel carried representatives of civilizations that had been freed from architect conditioning using the universal antidote that Marcus and his team had developed. The transformation had not been easy. Some species had required months of careful treatment to break conditioning that had been in place for generations. Others had initially refused help, believing that their controlled state was their natural condition. But gradually, through patient diplomacy and the undeniable evidence of restored mental freedom, a coalition had formed that spanned half the galaxy. Dr. Elena Vasquez approached with a datapad containing the latest reports from liberation operations. The Korthak delegation has confirmed that their homeworld is fully restored, she said, her voice carrying satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. That makes 38 species successfully freed from architect control. But Marcus, we need to talk about the architect response. Marcus nodded grimly. He had been expecting this conversation for weeks. As more species were liberated from mental conditioning, the architects had become increasingly desperate in their tactics. Instead of the subtle manipulation campaigns they had preferred in the past, they were now launching direct military assaults against liberated worlds, trying to recapture enslaved populations before they could be fully freed. How bad is it? Marcus asked. Bad. Intelligence reports suggest they're mobilizing their entire remaining fleet for a massive offensive. But there's something else. Our quantum surveillance network has detected evidence that they're experimenting with temporal manipulation technology. They might be trying to alter the timeline to prevent the liberation campaigns from ever happening. The news should have been devastating, but Marcus felt only a strange sense of calm. Over the past 2 years, he had learned that every escalation by the architects had ultimately led to opportunities for even greater cooperation between the liberated species. Their desperation was making them predictable, and their increasingly extreme tactics were driving neutral species to join the Liberation Coalition. Have you heard from residents of distant stars about the special project? Marcus asked. Elena's expression brightened slightly. The Etherians think they found a solution. They want to meet with you in the quantum laboratory this afternoon. The quantum laboratory was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, combining Etherian dimensional manipulation technology with human scientific methodology and Zephyrian biological systems. At its center was the most ambitious project Marcus had ever conceived, an attempt to address the root cause of architect desperation by offering them something they had never expected, a new home. Resonance of distant stars was waiting when Marcus arrived. Its energy formed more stable than it had been during their first meeting. Months of working together had taught the Etherian to modulate its quantum fluctuations, to make communication easier for material beings. Dr. Chen, we have achieved a breakthrough that surpasses our most optimistic projections, the Etherian announced, its mental voice carrying harmonics of excitement. Using the quantum manipulation techniques that you helped us develop, we have successfully created a stable pocket dimension that could support architect civilization. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Are you saying we can offer them a completely new universe to live in? Not merely a universe specifically designed to meet their biological and technological requirements. The pocket dimension can be expanded as needed and customized to support any type of civilization they wish to build. Most importantly, it would be entirely separate from our reality, eliminating any future conflict between architect needs and the independence of other species. The implications were staggering. Instead of fighting a war that could only end in the destruction of one side or the other, they could offer the architects something that would meet their needs without requiring the enslavement of other species. But Marcus knew that the most difficult part of the plan would be convincing the architects to consider it. After thousands of years of manipulation and control, they would be suspicious of any offer that seemed too good to be true. We need to make contact with them directly, Marcus said, and we need to do it in a way that demonstrates our genuine desire to help rather than defeat them. The opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days later, an architect fleet approached the coalition's main stronghold, apparently intending to launch a decisive assault that would break the liberation movement once and for all. But instead of preparing for battle, Marcus made a decision that shocked both his allies and his enemies. He ordered the entire coalition fleet to stand down and transmit a message of surrender. The message that went out on all frequencies was simple but unprecedented. To the architects, we surrender. We request immediate transportation to your command vessel for negotiation of terms. Dr. Marcus Chen will come alone and unarmed. The response from the architect fleet was confusion and suspicion. After hours of apparent debate, they agreed to transport Marcus to their flagship, but only after extensive scanning to ensure he carried no weapons or hidden devices. The architect command ship was unlike anything Marcus had imagined. The corridors were filled with a thick, golden atmosphere that supported several different types of architect physiology. The walls seemed to be alive, constantly shifting and adapting to optimize the ship's performance. But what struck Marcus most was the sense of desperate fatigue that permeated everything. These beings had been fighting for so long that they had forgotten how to do anything else. The architect leader that met him was ancient beyond human comprehension. Its crystalline exoskeleton scarred by countless battles and its optical sensors dimmed by eons of weariness. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of a civilization that had watched its universe die. I am called the final architect, it said through a translation device.
I have overseen the preservation protocol since our universe entered its death phase.
Why do you surrender now, when your coalition has achieved such success against our operations? Marcus looked directly into the alien's optical sensors, knowing that everything depended on the next few minutes. Because we've discovered that you're not our enemy. You're refugees trying to save your people from extinction. We want to help you do that without destroying ours. The final architect was silent for a long time, its form absolutely motionless. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a note that Marcus had never heard from any architect before. Hope. You would offer aid to those who have enslaved your allies and threatened your existence? We would offer aid to anyone whose suffering drives them to hurt others, Marcus replied. That's what healers do. We treat the disease, not just the symptoms. What followed were the most important negotiations in galactic history. Marcus explained the Pocket Dimension project, detailing how Etherian quantum manipulation technology could create a customizable universe that would meet all architect needs without requiring the subjugation of other species. The final architect's response revealed the true depth of architect desperation. You offer us a new universe, but how do we know it will not suffer the same fate as our original home? How do we know that entropy will not claim this refuge as it claimed everything we once loved? Marcus smiled, remembering something that Resonance of Distant Stars had mentioned during their planning sessions. Because this universe will be maintained by willing cooperation between multiple species, each contributing their unique capabilities to its stability and growth. The Etherians will provide quantum manipulation, humans will provide medical and scientific knowledge, Zephyrians will provide biological expertise, and you will provide your advanced technology and engineering skills. Together we can create something that's stronger than entropy itself. The negotiations took 3 weeks, during which representatives from all liberated species arrived to participate in creating what would become known as the Galactic Cooperation Accords. The agreement was unprecedented in its scope and ambition, not just a peace treaty, but a blueprint for interspecies collaboration that would reshape the understanding of what civilization could achieve. When the final architect finally agreed to the terms, its ancient voice carried an emotion that Marcus recognized from his years of treating trauma patients, the relief of someone who had finally found a reason to stop fighting. Dr. Chen, you have given my people something we had not experienced in millennia, hope for a future that does not require the suffering of others. We will remember this gift for as long as our species endures. As Marcus watched the first architect vessels begin their journey into the new pocket dimension, escorted by ships from the Liberation Coalition to help with the transition, he reflected on how far he had come from that first day in the medical bay of the Mercy's Call. He had started as a simple medic, trying to save individual lives, but he had ended up healing the psychological wounds of an entire galaxy. The universe was vast and